your book tour.
Hold on one second. Hi, this is Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are on this turbulent planet. So many dimensions of turbulence, it's hard to count them all, ranging from what's going on in the Middle East to Ukraine to the climate to the disinformation storms. And what I try to do in this show is cut through the complexity um, through conversation, knowing that we're not going to come out the other end with magic answers, but with directionality. I think directionality matters a lot. And I'm thrilled to have two wonderful writer, photographer, story crafters. Both of these books that we're going to talk about have imagery and words together. And by the way, I'm in the middle of a gale here in Wabanaki territory in Maine, and the light just flickered. We do have a generator that would kick on, but it would take me a few minutes for the internet to come back. So that's a conceivable bit of turbulence as well. Stay tuned. At any rate, here you're meeting Virginia Hanusik and Emily Raboteau. Virginia is in New Orleans, a place familiar with rough weather. And Emily is in the Bronx. Are you at home in the Bronx?
I'm in the Bronx, yeah.
A place that has been familiar with flooding, as we'll learn. Tibbetts Brook and your home where you live in now. You've experienced some of the things I'm experiencing here in Maine too. Mm. These books, Lessons for Survival, and Emily's book, Into the Quiet and Light. Yeah, it's very small on my screen. They're both really interesting to me. They're prismatic more than narrative, and I think each of you, we'll talk about this. You have a vision of communication that's sort of like the world is right now. It's not a neat and clean story, but at the same time, there's a way to convey ideas and get things moving in certain directions. So it's great to be both have you both here. And I thought we'd just start with a quick little answer from each of you to a tough question to make the answer small, but it's a useful question. What drew you to this kind of issue that you're writing about? You know, Emily, you focus on justice and history and race and so many other things, and climate, can always be sort of a tertiary element, but you've made it a significant part of what you think and write about. And we'll get to Virginia in a second. So Emily, just, what got you, why is this the way you're shaping your priorities and what you write about and think about?
For me, I think I was already writing about social justice issues and, to a degree, environmental justice issues through the lens of motherhood. And often I was doing that by writing about public art projects in my neighborhood that somehow commented on issues that I felt were threatening my kids. And so I was engaging with them on a really personal level, but then also on this other level that had to do with public art. And I was using my iPhone camera to document the artworks, in many cases because they were murals and I knew they would disappear. So it was an act of documentation, an act of witness, a way of kind of grappling with local threats. And then in 2018, after that IPCC report came out and media kind of changed, like the language that was showing up in the media around the climate crisis started getting more honest, more stark. I was noticing that. Like, I had read the David Wallace Wells piece in New York Magazine that then developed into his book, Uninhabitable Earth, when all of a sudden I came across a climate sign in Harlem, which is where I teach. And it arrested my attention in a new way. And then I started writing about the climate crisis as well.
Right. And your book starts with a pretty profound statement that let me just show that right now, because it's hold on, I'm just going to get back to that format. Just describe this moment. This is like the opening of the book.
Yeah, I wish I'd taken a photograph of this sign. Most of the photos in my book are a lot of them are of signs, like murals and signs of the times. And So this sign I didn't photograph, and I had to kind of represent it graphically. The end of the world is nigh, May 21st, 2011. That was my first child's predicted due date. He ended up being born on his due date, but yeah, that was supposed to be the rapture. I think we were just supposed to have it again during the eclipse, and it didn't happen. But
Depending on who you talk to, yeah. Right.
depending who you talk to. Anyway, this kind of language um, of the world coming to an end was around me a lot in the last weeks of my pregnancy, and people were predicting the end of days, not for the first time, but I wanted to kind of play with that in terms of thinking about how I didn't believe the world was coming to an end, but in a way, like, my world did come to an end after having kids. And so far as like my life as I had known it was over, my my freedoms um and certain perspectives were finished. And then also um things have really accelerated in terms of polycrises since that date, May 21st, 2011. Like it's been a difficult era to be raising children and thinking about the threats that are posed to their lives. And I'm not alone in this, obviously, but I wanted to articulate what it feels like to be parenting now in this book.
Right. No, you've done a great job. There's so much in the book that's we'll get into. And for you, Virginia, again, you're a photographer primarily, but is that fair to say?
Yeah.
But you build your output into projects that include much more than photographs. There's history and reflection, and in this book, a lot of other voices you've brought in. But and maybe it's a stupid question to ask someone who lives in New Orleans, why do you focus on climate? But what is it about the that particular frame that energizes you?
Yeah. I talk about this a lot in the introduction to the book around water being something that's omnipresent here. It touches every aspect of life. And I know that we were discussing before the live stream started our communal flooding experiences recently.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, how we've normalized that the city of New Orleans floods at a regular basis because the age of our infrastructure can't keep up with the impacts what our current climate is like and weather. So it's a regular reminder that the world that we've kind of manipulated and built and engineered is not equipped to handle our current reality. So
Right.
my background's actually in architecture, not so much studio, but history, theory, and thinking about the ways that the built environment form symbolize these larger issues and ideas around how we inhabit the earth, how we live with each other, and the natural world. So as an artist, my practice really didn't shift to focusing primarily on climate issues until I did move to Louisiana at this point almost 10 years ago. And I became more involved in the work that was going on with the state's coastal restoration plan, which is a $50 billion plan, primarily funded by the settlement money from the BP oil spill. So that's a very ironic way of restoring the coasts. But anyway, we'll probably get to some more of that later. But so for me, my approach as it's evolved over the past 10 years or so primarily has stuck with thinking about the ways that we have engineered ourselves into the land loss crisis that exists here, whether that's the engineering and leveeing of the Mississippi River, which, not to get into too much of the science behind it, but the Mississippi River has naturally changed course over its, thousands of years of moving across the delta, has been a primary factor in the creation of land in Louisiana. So you cut that off and you don't have this generative source. And then, of course, the oil and gas industry, which not just with the emission of fossil fuels, but with the pipelines and other kinds of invasive ways of cutting up the coast, that has accelerated the rate of erosion, because you have salt water that easily trickles in and kills off that marsh. So I say that because although my practice is primarily focused on infrastructure and architecture, it can be a very singular way of looking at the world. And with this book and kind of looking at the collection of images that I've made over all of these years, it was important for me to bring in a number of people that I've worked with in various capacities, whether or not that was professional, with projects, or personally, or folks who have had a range of experience with working in Louisiana, whether or not that's climate work, or in the arts, or in the seafood industry. What I've experienced as someone who is not from this place, and I make that, very clear and explicit as I set up kind of the framing of this book, is that there is, as much as it is a collection of my photographs, it's not a singular way of seeing this landscape. And when we're thinking about visualizing the climate crisis, there isn't a singular way of looking at it. I think that we've adopted in our visual culture a need to understand these complex issues in a very concise visual way. And in some cases, that's created a stock imagery for the climate crisis, which, we can debate its benefits and its the harm in that. But for me, with this project, and kind of just where I've found myself in Louisiana over all of these years, is that it's messy, that there is everyone's experience with this landscape is different. There are people who have had generational ties to Louisiana who are included in the book. And then there's people like me who have had the privilege of living here as a non-native for the past 10 years. So it's a really, it's just been a privilege to be able to work on something like this. And I'm lucky that I was able to convince 17 people to be involved in the book.
Yeah, and it does something that Emily does in hers as well. It's interspersing some pretty practical and policy relevant information with artistry at the same time. And we're going to get back into Emily's book in a second. Each of the images has some textual mini essays around what we should think about, including, you mentioned the culpability of the oil industry. Oil and gas goes way beyond just what they're doing to the atmosphere. That whole area of Louisiana is subsiding faster than sea level is rising because of all the messing around that's been done there as well. So that's what's cool about the books. They both have that sort of interface of the practical and lyrical. And I just want to show a couple of chunks from Emily's book too, as sort of conversation starters. You did a tour. Birds matter to you. They come in and out of the book over and over again in different ways. Can you describe what you think of as you were doing that journey related to birds in the Bronx and elsewhere in New York City?
Yeah, so one of the art projects that I documented in this book is the Audubon Mural Project. This is a series of murals that are painted all over Harlem and Washington Heights and Upper Manhattan which is where John James Audubon lived and where he's buried. So this is a project that's a partnership between the Audubon Society and a local gallerist and the business owners who allow these birds to be painted on their security gates. They're sometimes called riot gates. So you see that's the American redstart. And it's painted on the riot gate of this in Washington Heights, this pediatric kind of storefront clinic, which is the kind of place where Black and brown kids like mine go to get like nebulized when they have asthma attacks. I was really interested in the ways this project is documenting the 389 North American bird species documented by Audubon that are expected, owing to climate change, to be extinct by 2080. And so it's this kind of act, it's very sad and beautiful project having to do with memorialization and conservation. But I was interested too in writing about the overlap between the ways these birds are endangered and the way the people in Harlem and Washington Heights in Upper Manhattan are also endangered by poisoning infrastructure, among other things.
Right.
And so I wanted to write about, the overlaps between the threats posed to birds and the threats posed to people, Black and brown people in particular.
Yeah, you must have tracked the recent owl saga. That's
Flacco. You know what the latest is with Flacco? So there's like a particular tattoo artist who's like now got a design. A lot of people are getting tattoos of Flacco. For those in the audience who don't know, Flacco is this like Eurasian owl who escaped from the Central Park Zoo. They were originally going to trap him and put him back in the zoo, but he came to represent freedom for New Yorkers, and nobody wanted him to go back into a caged existence. So he lived for over a year, like, in the wilds of Manhattan, and recently died. And there have been memorials to him. There's been murals made in his honor. He was a very beloved bird.
And he, I think one of the resonant themes for a lot of New Yorkers around him was resilience. He was non-native and found a way to make his way. I did a webcast with Carl Safina, and who has a book out on owls and others on this, focused also on the hazards in cities for birds, even without climate change, the glass and everything. We all have to find ways to move forward amid a sort of as you said, polycrisis, polyhazards. And before we go ahead further, I want to ask you more about the mothering thing. You had already had your 2 children, but Virginia, you're not married. Are you married?
No, I'm not married.
Have you thought about any of that stuff in your life, going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I live in a deeply red state, so it's difficult as someone who's capable of getting pregnant to live in a state that is doesn't feel very safe for them. So I think that there's compounding issues when it comes to both the political and environmental factors that determine whether or not you want to have children.
Yeah, there you go. Right. That another dimension to the hazard landscape for sure. Choose your state. Boy. Emily, you described this book. I love you used the word scavenging for hope. That line really stuck with me as a core articulation, a little bit of what you both do with your cameras and your words. What's in the end, and we'll get to the end of the book, both books too, but what does it feel like when you've done a lot of scavenging? What do you end up holding in your heart and in your mind as you're thinking about how to go forward? I grapple with this. I'm 68 years old, and I've been writing about climate change since the 1980s, and not a lot changes. And I focus on lots of the brilliant little things, and it can be just really discouraging. But so, what's the sum total of when you're taking that approach?
I mean, for me, with the photography as a way into this, like the studying of murals that in many cases are commenting on hard stuff. This image that you have up, Andy, is from the Know Your Rights series.
Yeah.
So this is distinct from the bird mural series I was just talking about, but there is this overlap, right? Like, so this series um, was made. These murals are about police brutality, and they're the murals, many of which are gone. And so I really am glad that I documented them.
Mm.
Were put up in areas of New York City that are most plagued by police brutality. Um, and so this one is in Bushwick. Um, and the murals, it's hard to see in this image, but the content includes practical information about like the Fourth Amendment, what your rights are. Like you have the right to film police, and you have the right to remain silent, and this kind of stuff. Uh, and when I scavenged, like when I understood that this was a series, right, it made me want to travel across the 5 boroughs, like the areas where these murals existed, to take pictures of them and really engage with the subject that is so dark and so heavy and so personally frightening to me, also as the mother of 2 Black boys.
Mm.
You're kind of asking, like in the process of scavenging, I do describe these like journeys around the city to document these public art projects as scavenging, because when I find them, they're very beautiful. This is rendered in black and white in my book, but they're color photographs in
Yeah.
their original state, and they're so gloriously bright, and in many cases big, like this one. And they do offer me, anyway, like a sense of hope, because they're also painted as an act of love for the people in the community
Right.
who live there, right? And so um scavenging for me, when I say like I'm scavenging for hope, I mean that, like the process of taking these pictures is a way of thinking, like, or discovering there's a pattern here, right? These murals aren't even independent of each other. They exist as part of a larger project, often
Right.
in partnership with city agencies and artists and organizations that are really interested in justice in multiple multivalent ways. And so I also have interviewed the people involved in undertaking these projects, and um, it gives me hope to see that these, like, there are pattern, they're part of a pattern, and they're part of a group effort, like part of a community effort to try to address, in even if it's a small way, um, communication, like
Yeah.
storytelling about issues around justice, whether that's climate justice directly or social justice issues like with this one.
Yeah. And, the one thing that I've seen that I think is a defense of that scintillating landscape of little hopeful actions is there actually is a lot of power there. We think of global warming as a global issue that needs a treaty and United States laws and the like. But the more you look at it, you realize vulnerabilities are local. Like I interviewed one of the top climate and health experts in the world, Christy Ebi. She's at the University of Washington. I interviewed her during their big heat dome event. And she said then, and has said repeatedly, nobody needs to die in a heat wave. And it's through social awareness and local action and proaction, proactive stuff that can really make a difference. And all the global warming policy in the world won't change that. If there's a poor neighborhood with a woman who lives, alone in an unair conditioned apartment, it doesn't matter if the planet is heating. You can save that life with local policy, with local awareness. And what's his name? Eric Kleinenberg did that great study of Chicago during the great heat wave of Chicago in the 90s, finding that social cohesion, including through church groups, through whatever, pre-social media, knowing where the vulnerabilities are, you can really make a change. And then if you can communicate that, whether it's on a mural or with your neighbors or through social media as an individual or community, you can really make a difference. So I don't know if that feels cogent in New Orleans too, Virginia.
Yeah, I think that yes, going back to a term that was previously said earlier in our conversation around resilience, I think that that's a very tricky term down here. People are very invested in their communities and taking care of each other, not just in the aftermath of storms, but for the sake of, the context of this conversation. That's kind of what I'm referring to when we talk about resilience and how
For sure.
without a lack of some sort of comprehensive plan to not just mitigate the impacts of climate change, but to alter our reliance on fossil fuels after storms like, I was here for Hurricane Ida, and just seeing the response to that storm and how quickly aid ultimately left the area, and how long the recovery process is. It's almost like calling people resilient here is almost like a slap in the face, because there aren't necessarily resources to be able to adapt to a life that is not as vulnerable as what we're living in right now. So,
yeah. I was sorry, I was fooling with the slides there because I was fishing for a key line in Emily's book, which I'll show you here. Faced with the horrors of climate change, how do we define or redefine the term resilience? What do we mean when we name a person or place or a thing resilient? I think about this a huge amount, and obviously you both do as well. And then at the larger scale of national policy, so much of this is about how do you get resources aligned with where the lack of resilience is greatest, where the vulnerability is greatest. And I just thought we could talk about that because it relates to the justice point that I think you both think about a lot. I did this piece. It was when the infrastructure law came out, billions and billions and billions of dollars for infrastructure. And I was looking at, where U.S. Army Corps of Engineer money has been spent in the past. And it's like bolstering beaches at Miami and the Hamptons and communities that have lawyers and consultants who know how to navigate FEMA have a lot better chance of getting the billions than communities that don't. And it sort of drives me crazy. There's the Biden administration has a Justice 40 principle that's supposed to guide all of that. But how do you make that real? Emily, you've gone through all New York City's boroughs and have met people in all the states of brittleness, the opposite of resilience. Have you seen promise or possibilities in at the level of policy?
At the level of policy, not so much.
It's hard. I haven't either.
But I was interested in thinking about resilience beyond policy, and maybe that's a cop out. I don't know, but I mean, maybe it is. But I was trying to think about it over the course of this book. We often talk about resilience in terms of economics and policy and architecture, and I was really interested in like the spiritual element of that. The kind
I
of
think that's important.
yeah. I mean, one of the people I interviewed in my book who has a lot of resilience, and I love this, build what back better for whom, made me think of her. I call her Luce in the book, which is not her real name. She wanted me to mask her name, but she lost her home in Hurricane Sandy in 2012. She was living in a coastal community on Staten Island. She wasn't a homeowner, so unlike a lot of people in that community who were able to get the pre-storm values of their homes and like move on, she was renting an apartment in somebody's basement. The rental wasn't even in her name, it was in her brother's name, and so she lost everything and wasn't able to enjoy any sort of like government anything to build back her life. She ended up going down these sort of like wormholes of prepper sites, and she ended up moving into a van. A lot of people would describe her as homeless, but that's not how she thinks of herself. She describes herself as a climate refugee. She continues to live in New York in a van, which she has named Langston Hughes. And I met her at a house party in Washington Heights, and she was grilling me. She was like, "You're the parent of 2 children. Do you have a bug out bag? Like, do you have a lot of cash on hand? Do you have a generator in your apartment? Like, have you thought about, solar power?" All these things that I had not thought about. And to me, she has a lot of resilience, right? Like a lot of
Right.
gumption, a lot of wisdom, and a lot of knowledge, having lived through disaster at this level that some of us have not had to live through yet. And I wanted to profile her as like an environmental expert, because she's not the kind of person who's often given the mic, but
Right.
having lived through disaster, has a lot to teach us about resilience. I was interested in those kind of people, interviewing those kind of people in this book. I know, Virginia, it sounds like you talked to a lot of folks for your book too. So I wonder what kind of resilience you've seen demonstrated in that landscape that maybe doesn't have necessarily to do with policy, or maybe does.
I'm showing one set of images of her work that displays personal, or at least homeowner, resilience.
Mhm.
What do
Yeah,
you
I
think?
think that I'm just being someone that's just naturally drawn to architecture to talk about these things. It's um, been interesting. I mean, when I first moved here and going outside of the New Orleans levee system and into the coastal parishes, you start to see this architecture where houses are, excuse me, raised as high as 20 feet in the air. But what was interesting to me and continues to be is just the diversity in style and form and how unique these structures are. It is an expression of, I don't know if you want to call it art, but personal expression. But also, if you dig deeper into why certain structures are raised higher, why there are some places that are slab on grade, you get into kind of the nitty gritty of how architecture, this type of architecture, is influenced by federal policy around flood insurance and disaster relief and who gets access
Right.
to that money to elevate their homes. Or who's capable of elevating their houses on their own dime. A lot of places, I think that a maybe baseline reading of this work may allude to these being in areas that I don't know, like the stereotypical Louisiana swamp. You know how that's been portrayed visually and what people think of when they think of South Louisiana. A lot of these structures are camps, which means that they're not someone's primary home, which means that in a lot of these cases, it's people that are able to afford to have these structures in a place that's not covered by flood insurance. So if something happens to it, you're responsible for just covering the cost of repairs.
Right.
So I'm getting way off tangent. I'm sorry. As I start to talk about flood insurance,
No.
like where the hell are we? But
Well, I'm showing these two images taken by Charles Coulter, who's a geographer in LSU, who I wrote about a few years ago. And this relates to one other issue around resilience, which is profit and how zoning and the other rules we have in different communities are setting us up for really bad outcomes. The house on the top was built like in the 1970s. It was flooded in that Baton Rouge mega deluge that I wrote about, I don't know, 2017 or so. And the house on the bottom is a 19th century house in the similar part of New Orleans, of Louisiana, that's elevated. This is before FEMA and, money flows. It just shows a certain logic, a certain rationale for how we live that was more grounded in being elevated. That, and I don't think this, no one would prefer to live in the or buy the house in the top rather than the house in the bottom. But a lot of it's about a lack of awareness. And actually, Emily, in your book, you have your capping section is about your learning curve with flooding in the Bronx. And where I live here now in Maine, we have coastal flooding that we're trying to figure out how to live with. So, you know, how much of this is about I don't know if it's a human, some of it's amnesia, forgetting, some of it's not knowing. And then you have climate change on top of all that.
And some of it is also what's withheld from us.
Oh, yeah, that too. Right.
Like whether or not we're buying in a flood zone is not always clear.
Right.
So our pandemic move, we live, my kids were born in Washington Heights and upper Manhattan. And like the name suggests, like a lot of neighborhoods in New York City, when it has heights behind it, it means because it's up high, like it's on a cliff face often, maybe overlooking water. And,
Right.
because so much of the city is ringed by the highways, like, thank you, Robert Moses, we often forget how much water surrounds us and that we're actually a city of, we're like an archipelago of 40 islands.
Right.
It's not something many people carry in their mind. I wish we had an aerial shot of New York City the way we did of your region, Virginia, just so you could see how much water, right? So our pandemic move was from Washington Heights to the Bronx, and a lot of people were fleeing New York City at the time. We chose to buy a house, and the reason we wanted to leave Washington Heights was a good, like, 2 reasons. We didn't have enough space, and we really felt that during the pandemic, like, living as a family of 4 and under 800 square feet, we were just really tight, and,
That's officially tight.
it was really tight for, like, 2 years. It was really, really tight not to leave that space. We felt, imprisoned in some ways. And then, also because of the poisoning infrastructure that I mentioned, living in a fence line community, like my
Right.
kids, like a third of the kids in the zip code have asthma. Um, that's 6 times the nationwide average and 3 times the citywide average because it's a neighborhood encircled by highways and also overlooking the George Washington Bridge, which is the most heavily trafficked bridge in the world. And also there's a wastewater treatment nearby and a major bus depot. It just felt like the air was toxic. And so we bought this house. We did our due diligence to learn that it wasn't in a floodplain according to the information that we saw. Um, but then discovered after like closing that the house has this like big pond in front of it that we didn't understand is like until I did the research and looked at these old maps of the US Geological Survey that really this like much of New York City, we living on like backfilled wetlands.
Absolutely.
And this pond in front of our house, which is almost always there, like it goes away owing to evaporation, but because we get like 60% more major rain events, these like rain, heavy, heavy precipitation events, it's like it's not a puddle, it's a pond, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
a serious body of water that's troubling, and then I looked at these old maps and saw, oh, actually, our house is sited on this, stream. This Tibbetts Brook used to flow under our actual house, and it got
Right.
diverted when they changed the landscape to make it a built environment, and they buried it, and it now flows, like, through the sewer system and, uh and it mixes with our waste. Like you were saying, Virginia, our infrastructure just isn't built to handle all of the water we're getting now. And so, it shuts down the wastewater treatment plant. It gets overburdened, and then all that raw sewage just goes out into the Harlem River and makes people sick. And so, interestingly, I mean, you were asking about policy and resilience. One thing that's happening in our neighborhood in the Bronx that's kind of cool is that they're daylighting the brook, meaning they're unburying it as an act of
Yeah.
climate mitigation, and this project has been underway for over 20 years with multiple city agencies, including the Parks Department and, local politicians and just local citizens involved, and it's gonna be the first daylighting story in New York City, which is a city with a lot of buried water. Um, but then at a certain point, you also have to ask, like, is this the best use of many millions of dollars? Ought this money maybe spent in a different way, thinking about managed retreat? I don't, I'm wrestling with this now and writing about it, not just in relation to our home. This is the last chapter of my book is called The Dream House and the Pond, like what it
Right.
means to be able to come to a place of privilege, to be able to own a home, but then also the vulnerability, particularly when you live in a red line community. Like, we're talking about the vulnerability is local, but also vulnerability is intersectional. So where we see where
Absolutely.
we see like the flooding happening in the city is where we see the police brutality happening, is where we see, more COVID deaths happening, and where more kids have asthma and all of these things.
Yeah, I've written a ton about this issue. In 2009, I wrote about daylighting Yonkers. Has daylighted the Sawmill River, which ran underneath Yonkers,
Mm-hmm.
and it's actually improved the landscape of the city. I was in Seoul, South Korea. They took this insane tangle of highways and they ripped it out. There was a very strong-willed mayor. His nickname
Mm-hmm.
was Bulldozer, and but even he had to they did something like 100 community meetings to sort of set the stage for unraveling all that stuff in Seoul and and daylighting the Cheonggyecheon, the stream. And I guess here, this is, as you said, with policy, one of the things that really needs to be done is more communication. Your book is part of that for sure. And I mean, New Orleans has lived with this even more than just about anywhere on the planet, I think. But understanding the hydrological history of the lands we live on, or out west, the fire history.
Mm-hmm.
It's the
Mm-hmm.
same thing. Just like we have floodplains, they have fire plains essentially. And if you build a town on a grassland with an upslope with high winds and hot days, your town is vulnerable. If you don't know that, then you're just setting yourself up for more disasters. And as Emily, as you just said, a lot of this is about making sure the landscape is fair for everybody. People who are marginalized through race or poverty or other reasons, or just not in line to get that information or make those choices, and they're not, they're not also homeowners. So they when this happened in Houston, the Hurricane Harvey. Back then, I wrote about it. We think about all the losses of. Mostly, what gets tallied is insured losses, but what about the renters who had no insurance, who barely were housed to begin with, and who ended up being dislocated? Their lives are even hard to chart going forward. So you're both doing a good job of getting at those issues. And what who should? This is always a silly question. Who do you crave should be reading or experiencing your books? Who do they need to be seen by? Maybe Emily and then Virginia. It's easy to say everyone, but like, who's the dream reader?
For me, I think because I was really writing from a perspective of like an angry mother. uh, my audience, I think, is also angry mothers. And I don't even mean like, that the subtitle of my book is Mothering Against the Apocalypse. So I'm thinking
Right.
about mothering as like a verb instead of a noun. And I'm also not even thinking about it like merely in biological terms, but rather as Gloria Steinem meant it, and another feminist writer I really love, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, means it as like a kind of stance about radical care. Like I'm trying to. I think in one sense, I think the audience for this book is like women of my generation who have a mothering spirit, whether they're biological mothers or not, who are really interested in how care, as Sadia Hartman says, is the antidote to violence, um, and who are also motivated, like not merely by love, but also by anger and rage,
Yeah.
who are thinking about intergenerational justice, and who feel a lot of pressure because we're being told, our generation, like we're running out of time, and our generation owes something to the next generation and wasn't exactly prepared by our parents because they didn't have this on their mind, and they weren't necessarily prepared by their parents. So yeah, I'm kind of thinking about as in terms of audience, I think I'm thinking about in particular women around my age, women between 35 and 55 who are just really pissed off.
Okay, well, I'll tweet that out.
Thanks. What about you, Virginia?
I'm in that category. I think that, for me, it was important when I have been working with my wonderful team at Columbia, who have been so generous in thinking through how this book was going to be presented. And from the beginning, we were all on the same page that we didn't want it to be a quote unquote art book, a coffee table book of photographs. Um, I don't see my practice that way, as a formalized kind of, again, singular way of looking at the world. So thinking through how to structure and include a way of intertwining different stories with the images themselves was really, it was an amazing experience to be able to do that. And I think that as much as the work is hyper, it's much more, it's localized. It's about a very specific place over a period of time. It's of course important to me, and I hope that folks who live or have ties to this area find something in the book that speaks to them, that they see something in. I hope for that, and that's important to me. But I also think that there's so much to learn and gain if you're not immersed in this landscape, that there are so many connections, that these issues expand geography when you're talking about these environments that are not just coastal, but in the case of Louisiana, a very, very strong history of extraction and exploitation around natural resources that, again, is not unique to here, but has happened at a level of severity that I think the things that we're experiencing here, and what a lot of contributors to the book talk about in their own writing, is the impacts that that's had psychologically on their families, on them, on the way that they live in the world and in this space. So I think that there's a lot of ways of reading the book, and that's with intention. So although there's not a very specific audience or reader that we're marketing towards, I think that there are a lot of people that may gain something from looking and reading it.
One thing I was just thinking, Emily, particularly about your book and mothering, and this idea of lessons for survival, which come through in all those interesting vignettes in Louisiana as well, is this extra burden that comes when you're a mother or and a father. You're committing to a future, and climate change is implicitly you're bringing the future into the room in ways that we as humans often kind of avoid. Like we don't think about our mortality on a daily basis, and so that there's a lot of burden that comes to that. And is part of the writing and photographing for you, so I don't want to use the word therapeutic, but how do you maintain your own capacity to survive and thrive? It seems to be an important part of what we all have to do if we're working in this arena. And there was this line, another line from Emily's book: is it possible to be haunted by the future as well as the past? I think that's what comes with climate, grappling with the climate problem, is you're essentially haunted by the future. On Monday, I'll be doing a show with the PBS, the folks behind the PBS series. It's about the future, it's sort of making the future palpable and solvable. So what does that, Emily, you could just talk about that section of the book and that idea, and as it relates to mothering and writing.
Yeah, I guess, and hope, which is what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I started taking these pictures after Trump was elected in 2016, because I was in such despair, and actually in physical pain. I was so triggered that it did make me feel in the same way that some people go running, or they have some sort of like a repetitive act that gives some relief, like knitting, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was going out on these long walks, taking pictures of public art. understanding there was a pattern and that it was, that these artworks were made out of a sense of community and out of a sense of love did give me a feeling of solace. And when I think about this feeling of being haunted by the future or being, anxious about the future, uh, I think that's like a really appropriate feeling not to lose, like not to try to assuage to the degree that it like, that it goes away, but to hold on to it along with the other feelings involved. Including rage and including sometimes hope, right? Like, I feel like for me, the biggest lesson talking to folks who are smarter than myself about survival is, survival is more assured in community, like when we undertake working through problems together and not in an individualistic way. Um, so one of the people I had the privilege of talking to for this book was a Yupik elder in Alakanuk, Alaska. This is in the Arctic in many ways, ground zero of climate crisis in terms of level of warming. And he was an octogenarian who remembers the time before the warming began. And I was asking him about changes to the landscape and changes to the water and what he's witnessed. But I also asked him, what do you do with your anger? Especially after it came to light that he had been one of these children who were ripped from their family and sent to a
Mm.
Catholic residential school and robbed of his language and his hair in an effort to kill the Indian in the child. Like, but it didn't work. I mean, he survived that. And when I asked him quite humbly, like, what is your lesson for me to carry back to my home place about survival? And what do you do with your anger? He said, that's easy. We take care of each other. I mean, and this is a person who lives in a landscape where the salmon are gone or going. The houses are falling into the river because the
Right.
the very land they're walking on is no longer solid. They can't put the game that they've hunted or the fish that they've fished under the ground the way they used to be to keep cold and fresh because the permafrost is gone or going. Um, yeah, for me, just trying to remember that basic principle of care, like radical care. We just, in spite of it all, and in our messy way, we continue taking care of each other and trying to work through this together.
That's a vital point. The community again feels like a key part of this. We're running short of time. I don't know if you can go past the hour. Probably not. But there's a couple more questions. One is the role of art. You focus on the murals as well, and of course, Virginia's work is essentially works of art, capturing those images. But are there other artists that you think about, or other arts that you think about when you look at this issue? I know you followed Justin Gorigli. I can never pronounce Justin's last name. He's a friend of mine, and I still have trouble pronouncing
Me
his
too.
name. At any rate, Justin, who does these fascinating installations, which you have in the whole journey in the book with the uh, Mick Awake. What do you think the role of art is more generally in getting us through these times?
I mean, I'll answer that briefly, and I'm interested to hear what Virginia has to say. But um, Justin had staged these climate signs. There were 10 of them around the parts of New York City most threatened by the climate crisis, whether by the urban heat island effect or by flooding. And so I came across this first one you see on the left in Harlem. This is on the James Baldwin lawn of St. Nicholas Park, near where I teach at City College. I took a picture of it, wondering like, what is this? Climate change at work. It was flat, and that's only one of the messages. It was flashing things like 50 million climate refugees, climate denial kills. These like very alarming messages. And it's not, obviously, it's not where it's supposed to be. This is a road sign. It should be in the road saying icy conditions
Right.
or something. And I posted it on Twitter, formerly or X, formerly known as Twitter, as you can see. And then this guy Mick, who I didn't know at the time, posted an identical sign in Sunset Park where he lives. And then we did a little sleuthing and found out, this was, again, part of a pattern. Like, there is an artist who is engaged with this subject, who's trying to teach,
Right.
who's trying to make you confront this issue. And so I invited Mick on a journey to go visit them all. And alarmingly or surprisingly, given the fact that he didn't know me, he said yes, and we did that. But yeah, Justin's work is, really touched me, not because I find it beautiful, like some of the murals, but because I found it like as a way of climate storytelling or messaging, again, as an act of love. I found it like it cut through the language of the state. It like registered with my limbic system, which had already been triggered by like David Wallace Wells's writing. And as I mentioned, 2018, like the language was changing, and this was part of that awakening for me. And I think art has the power to do that in a way that's very singular.
Yeah.
Justin's project was in partnership with the Climate Museum, which does some really amazing work. I'll conclude by saying its director, Miranda Massey, talks about this a lot, that like museums have a lot of public trust. Art has a lot of power because it's not the language of politics or policy. It's more akin to poetry. Like, it's more akin to be able to speak straight to our it goes straight to our bloodstream or our heart or whatever it was
Yeah.
that happened to me when this Yupik man said, we take care of each other. Like, that's a demonstration of what this art is doing, right? And it made me want to do a version of community care by like becoming friends with this man I didn't know,
Yeah.
to really learn about this and think through it together, because I was too scared to think through it alone.
And I'm sure in New Orleans, again, in your work, Virginia, you must think about this a lot as an artist.
Yeah, I think that art is so many things, but where we find or look for meaning and connection to each other. And the emotional quality of making these images has been a very important thing to me, just because it's not just images of someone. It's not just an image of a house or a flood wall. In a lot of cases, it's something that has a deep history with people who have inhabited the space and have different experiences with that infrastructure itself. So I think that more than just raising awareness, it's a tool for, as Emily mentioned, bringing people together, obviously, in ways that feel more fueled by emotion and something deeper. Just our human tendency for love and wanting to weather the storm together or with someone. A lot of the material, just sorry that I keep referencing my book, but it's because of the material is very dark, but there is so much light that comes into it, through people, their stories, the ways of seeing this space in a way that's not just through a lens of disaster, which has primarily been portrayed in the media.
Right.
So yeah, I think art has there is no capacity to what it's able to provide for people in terms of becoming more engaged and acting in the climate field and in other, important issues that we're facing right now.
It's great. And I think you're illustrating to a key point about art, just as your books demonstrate about writing, that there's no one form. There's no one purpose to. One of my favorite artists in this arena is Stacey Levy, who does art that actually remediates, which to me, I show this slide sometimes when I'm speaking about this, because I mean, Robert Smithson to me embodies the I wouldn't say the worst, but a very antiquated idea of art. He created the spiral jetty and the Great Salt Lake, with a lot of bulldozers and a lot of rock, and it's a static thing and very brittle. And Stacy does these spiral wetlands, which are floating, and they actually suck nutrients out of overpolluted ponds. And I've had her on the show very early in the pandemic. She came on Sustain What to talk about her work. She also, some of her work also gets at what Emily was talking about earlier with the importance of revealing the past hydrological history of landscapes. In Philadelphia, there's these like sculpted things on the sidewalk that are the river that used to be there. So this has been a great discussion. Maybe we can come back sometime and dig in deeper on some particular point that we've made. I think you're both doing fantastic work. I love the opening quotations in Emily's book from Salk and Octavia Butler, two very different people, get at some of the key ideas we've explored today. If we want to be good ancestors, we should show future generations how we coped with an age of great change and great crises. Live, hold out, survive. I don't know whether good times are coming back again, but I know that won't matter if we don't survive these times, Octavia. So thanks, both of you, for coming on Sustain What. And this show can be shared as soon as we're done on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. There's videos now that'll be archived and shareable. And I just love what you're doing. Keep it up and stay in touch.
Thanks so much.
Bye.